Hello, everyone, and welcome to this chapter on Central American's intervention coming home to roost. And what I want to go over today is just an overview and some of the things I mentioned on how Central American studies is really growing. So what we learned from Juan Gonzalez was that history we saw in the Harvest of Empire documentary, the overview of why Latinx populations have migrated into the United States, and U.S. interventionism and imperial power having a huge role in that. So in our times now, we see a huge focus on Central American populations. Where we began was with the integration of the first Latino population into the U.S. polity via conquest, with the second conquest of Mexico in 1848 with Mexicans that we've covered. And we've discussed how many people's populations from south of the border are racialized as Mexican, and Central Americans fit that mold, right? So what we've read is how their integration has taken place, and I wanted to highlight the Cesar Chavez Department of Chicano, and now just recently added Central American Studies at UCLA. This is a department that is really expanding that examination of these populations on how and their forced migration from those places. This is the way some of the tweets that we viewed coming out of the White House. Again, that the way that these populations are racialized and seen as being criminals, and that has a whole history going back to that initial integration, going back into the early 1800s. One of the things we had discussed beyond Central America, moving to South America, is the role of neoliberalism has had in really shaping the economies and shaping U.S. intervention into those places. We discussed Chile as one of the sites where that has taken place. Big uprisings have taken shape, and this concept of neoliberalism, I will also be uploading a video on explaining neoliberalism, something I just found that I found was useful in these times to really understand that economic philosophy we discussed in class today. And this is some of the data from the Pew Research Center. When you're looking at, and we know now in 2020, we're in the midst of the 2020 census, so we know these numbers will probably be rising. We know there's been an ebb and flow recently. So we'll take a look at how these populations have been counted over time and how they will be counted in the current 2020 census. So from the textbook, and here's an image of La Matanza that took place in 1932 under the direction of General Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, and the slaughtering and the elimination of the indigenous populations. And what this really shaped was the erasure of indigeneity in El Salvador. And El Salvador really tried to shore up this concept of mestizaje, or really move into what we've elaborated and thought of as whiteness in the United States, right? So that's a way to think about how citizenship and the census that we just mentioned was utilized as a technology, as my colleague Raul Moreno Campos has argued, that this moment, and the census in particular, was a mechanism, a technology by the state in El Salvador of erasing that indigenous population. And in that moment, what we read about was a revolutionary, Agustin Farabundo Marti, which, as you see here, pictured, who rose up and really challenged the state at the time. But you see the FMLN, the Farabundo Marti Liberación Nacional, a revolutionary movement that arose in opposition to the consolidation and the monopolization of the wealth in El Salvador. And on the right, you see president who arose from the FMLN and was elected to as president in recent times. So you have that move from a revolutionary force to the transition to a traditional political realm and actually gaining the presidency, right? The FMLN. That was pretty historic, just about within this last decade. And I had one thing I just wanted to discuss briefly was this notion of liberation theology. So liberation theology, as you read here, it's a fusion of think of these notions of Christianity and siding with the poor, but really taking on a social activist realm where the church does not sit back as a neutral uh, kind of takes a neutral stand. It really takes an active role in trying to really work with its mostly peasant or poor populations to transform their society. It's how do we create their heaven on earth. And what we had is Archbishop Oscar Romero here, who doing that uprising in the 1980s, was assassinated during when he took took on the preferential option of the poor and spoke out against the oligarchs in El Salvador and the right-wing backed dictatorships that were supported by the United States. And during Mass, he was assassinated. And this is a civil war. And these are some of the imageries, very troubling. We know that over 80% of the atrocities were attributed to the military, to the right-wing death squads, and many supported with U.S. dollars, foreign aid. This is what Gonzalez says. Washington quickly turned El Salvador into the biggest recipient of American military aid in Latin America. 70% of the record $3.7 billion the U.S. pumped into the country from these years went for weapons and war assistance. So that is a large amount, not only for food and aid, but mostly for armament. And this led to huge opposition in the United States that really sought to cut off U.S. taxpayer money from funding the atrocities and the human rights violations in El Salvador in the 1980s. So this shows how social movements here in the United States stood up against their own country's involvement in El Salvador, which led subsequently to a mass exodus of people in the United States. So we understand why in El Salvador, folks from El Salvador established roots in Washington, D.C., in Los Angeles, amongst other places, but we see these huge populations that begin to emerge due to U.S. involvement in those moments in El Salvador. And now Guatemala, and here's another, some census data, some counts on the populations, and we know, again, as I mentioned, this is being, again, we're having a count right now as we speak. In Guatemala, when we spoke of the year 1954, where Jacobo Arbenz was democratically elected and sought to nationalize some of the land that the United Fruit Company, who owned vast territories of the country. And you see a picture of the bananas here that were exported for profit. And this is something that we want to think about, is what is the value of a thing, right? And think of, again, from the moment that we're living in. Food is a necessity. How will we survive the next days without it, right? So here, and who places a price on it? What is its value? And how does it move from being a fruit or a food that serves to nourish us so we can live and breathe and exist, versus putting a price on it? Who puts that price on it? Well, here, when you have a corporation who has the monopoly on bananas, they get to set the price and export it to the places that will pay that price, namely in the United States. So when Jacobo Arbenz seeks to nationalize, this was a threat to not only the United Fruit Company, but U.S. foreign interest. And what you read about are the Dulles brothers in the in the Gonzalez text, who were not only very powerful brothers, Secretary of State and CIA director at the time, who really sought to undermine the democratic rule of Jacobo Arbenz and side with the United Fruit Company in really regaining and maintaining that territory. Here's an image of Jacobo Arbenz, who sided with the peasantry. This is, again, during a period during the Cold War where a lot of propaganda was used to label him as a communist because he was listening to the peasants and to folks in the Communist Party about maybe land redistribution, about they had a seat at the table for there, and therefore he was forever linked with them and justified the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz. And here's a link. You can watch this if you'd like to show you some of how that civil war persisted, and which lasted from this period, there almost 40 years. And many of those who were assassinated were indigenous Maya. So the indigenous Maya are a majority, remain a majority numerically in Guatemala, yet hold no political power. So revolution was an option. It was the only option that was seen for them for not to give up their lands that they subsisted on. And many remain disappeared to this day. And many of those folks in recent times are still who committed many of the atrocities, again, supported by the United States and funded by our tax dollars, are still out there. So Nicaragua, and again, what I'm giving you here is just a broad overview, and we can discuss this. So as you're doing the readings, jot down some questions, we can have further discussion. So Nicaragua, again, is in that mix of a dictatorship that is supported, a family dictatorship from the Somoza family, who ruled very with authoritative measures, but supported by the United States. And it wasn't until 1979, another peasant revolutionary movement, the Frente Sandinista for Liberación Nacional, named after Augusto Sandino, who was a revolutionary in the early 20th century, finally gained power. And this is where you see the United States really trying to destabilize Nicaragua. So you had three nations where people were migrating from. People are becoming refugees of wars. But yet in El Salvador and Guatemala, we see the U.S. government not allowing those populations into the U.S. And it's allowing the folks from Nicaragua in. And this is all due to foreign policy efforts to undermine the Sandinista government. And this leads to the Iran-Contra affair, and you can read this. I have a link here. And then we can talk some more about this. So the exodus to El Norte and to the United States begins with these acts during these times. You have the 1952 Immigration Nationality Act, known as the Walter McCarran Act, the 1980 Refugee Act. And here you have some numbers in 1979 in these cities where folks from El Salvador settled. So on that note, we will touch base and pick it up from here next time.